Today we're going to talk about the endocrine system, specifically what hormones are released, where they come from, and where they actually exert their action. Now, what we're going to talk about initially is the brain, because the brain ultimately is going to control a lot of this, specifically the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So let's go ahead and start there by drawing the pituitary gland. So this is going to be my pituitary gland, and I'm going to divide this pituitary gland right in half. It's going to have an anterior half, referred to as the anterior pituitary. And it's going to have a posterior half, referred to as the posterior pituitary gland. And they look different under the microscope, and the reason they look different is because they are different. They actually produce and do different jobs. They have different functions. Now, just above this pituitary gland that sort of hangs off the bottom of the brain is going to be the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus does double duty. First of all, it's going to be involved in neurological activity of the brain. But here, it's going to be involved in endocrine function too. It exerts control over both the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus is going to make two hormones that we're going to talk about. And these two hormones are going to be produced by the hypothalamus, and then they're going to work their way down into the posterior pituitary, where the posterior pituitary is going to store them until they're needed. So I'm going to write storage, because that's what actually happens here. The posterior pituitary stores these hormones until they're needed. So what hormones are we actually talking about here? One of the hormones is referred to as oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is a hormone that's involved during childbirth. It's going to be responsible for contraction of the uterus. The uterus is actually, there's a large part of the uterus that's actually a muscle. So when oxytocin is released, this muscle actually contracts, and it actually helps push baby out during childbirth. Now, baby's also an active player, but the oxytocin, helps mom contract that uterus and push baby out. So let's go ahead and write that down. Contraction of uterus, and also the mammary glands. Now, the mammary glands produce milk. So when the mammary glands contract, they actually expel milk. And that makes sense because after baby is born, baby's going to want a meal. So the milk is there waiting for baby. And after that, this hormone is going to be released. Now, another hormone that's going to be produced is called antidiuretic hormone. Also known as ADH, antidiuretic hormone. And I guess the first thing we should talk about here is, what does the word diuretic mean? A diuretic is a substance that increases your urination. That's what it does. Caffeine is a diuretic. Alcohol is a diuretic. Those things are diuretics. So antidiuretic obviously does the opposite. It actually helps you retain water. So when would this actually be produced? Well, it's going to be produced, for example, you're a soccer player and you're out running around on the playing field during a hot day. You're losing a lot of water in your sweat. You do not want to lose more water in your urine. So your body's going to produce more antidiuretic hormone to try to retain that water from being lost in your urine. Now, an interesting thing happens here, especially with alcohol and beer and wine and other alcoholic beverages. Alcohol actually inhibits the release of this hormone from the posterior pituitary, so it never gets to its target cells in the kidney. And therefore, the kidney, instead of reabsorbing water like it should, actually allows all that excess water to go out. And we end up waking up the next day all dehydrated because we didn't produce any I shouldn't say we didn't produce it, we didn't release the antidiuretic hormone, and therefore, in a sense, the floodgates were opened up. So a good hormone to have working properly, antidiuretic hormone. So let's go ahead and write something, reabsorption of water. In the kidney, specifically the nephron, the distal convoluted, not the distal convoluted tube, the collecting duct, and a little bit of the distal convoluted tubule of the kidney is where this is going to happen, where that effect is going to be seen. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary is actually going to make hormones. Again, under the control of the hypothalamus, but here instead of storing the hormones, the anterior pituitary is going to make them itself and then release them as needed. So what are some of these hormones that are going to be made? Well, number one, growth hormone. Now, growth hormone, like its name implies, causes the growth of structures, especially a growing child. Skeletally, they're getting taller and taller. And the more growth hormone that's released, the taller the child is going to be. Now, growth hormone also does other things. It causes the muscles to grow. It causes the heart to grow. It causes the digestive organs to grow. It causes the tissue in the skin to grow. So it's really growth of everything, including your cartilage. So this stuff is very, very important. Unfortunately, once in a while, with athletes, this hormone actually gets abused. Athletes take this hormone to get increased muscular growth, to increase their energy availability, and it works. But the problem is that it also causes your heart to enlarge, and that doesn't go back to normal. And it causes your digestive organs to enlarge, and again, doesn't go back to normal. So there can be some nasty side effects when you take something over and above what your body would normally produce. Now, another hormone is going to be follicle stimulating hormone. So let's go ahead. I'm going to draw a picture here. I'm going to draw a couple pictures because follicle stimulating hormone does different things in a female as opposed to a male. So let's go ahead. I guess I'm going to draw an arrow over here, and I'm going to draw the male endocrine system in a sense, the testes. So here we go. So this is going to be the testis, a single testis. And follicle stimulating hormone, that's what this is going to be, follicle stimulating hormone, all abbreviated FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, is going to cause the testis to produce more sperm. So sperm production. Now, in a woman, it's going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw the female reproductive tract. I'm going to draw a couple structures here. Let me go ahead and draw it over here. Let's go ahead and just label the parts very quickly. These two structures right here are going to be the ovaries. This structure and this structure right there are going to be the oviducts or uterine tubes or fallopian tubes. They go by those names. This structure right here is going to be the uterus. And down here is the birth canal or vagina. Now, follicle stimulating hormone is going to act on these ovaries. So I'm going to write FSH again, follicle stimulating hormone. And it's going to stimulate the development of a follicle. So what's a follicle? Well, a follicle is simply an egg. So I'll go ahead and draw that. There's a very enlarged egg. And then around this egg are helper cells called follicle cells. So we'll label those. Those are follicle cells. And collectively, the whole structure, the follicle cells, and there could be tens to hundreds, and the egg itself is referred to as a follicle. So follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate this follicle, meaning the egg and the follicle cells, to further develop. And that eventually is going to result in the release of an egg each month. And that egg, the goal here is for that egg ultimately to become fertilized so that reproduction occurs. But that's what follicle stimulating hormone is going to do. It's going to stimulate, in a sense, egg development. Now, let's go on to another hormone, luteinizing hormone. And again, luteinizing hormone has effects both on the male and on the female. So let's go ahead and start with the male. Luteinizing hormone, again, it's going to affect the testes. So luteinizing hormone, also abbreviated LH, luteinizing hormone. And what that does is it acts on the testes, certain cells in the testes, to produce testosterone. So causes testes, ES, that's plural, to produce testosterone. And testosterone is another hormone. Both male and females produce testosterone. Obviously, males produce more testosterone, and that's going to be produced in the testes. And testosterone is also produced to some degree in the adrenal cortex, the outer part of the adrenal glands. So testosterone is going to be responsible in large part for male secondary sex characteristics. So let's write that down. Male secondary sex characteristics. CHAR. Good enough. And male secondary sex characteristics are those sex characteristics you acquire during puberty. For a male, it would be a deepened voice, increased musculature. It would be hair development in the arms and groin region. Things like that. Those are male secondary sex characteristics. And testosterone is primarily going to be responsible for that. Now, so luteinizing hormone comes down and it increases the production of testosterone, which then is responsible for male secondary sex characteristics. What about women? Well, luteinizing hormone, and I'm going to draw it coming down and around a little bit. It's also going to target the ovaries. So LH, luteinizing hormone. And LH is going to cause the ovaries, specifically the corpus luteum in the ovaries, to produce estrogen and progesterone. So it's going to cause the ovaries to then produce estrogen and progesterone. So let's go ahead and we're going to write, I guess we'll do it this way. We'll draw from this ovary another line going to the uterus, because that's where these two hormones are going to target primarily. So estrogen and progesterone. And let me go ahead and rewrite that. I'm going to rewrite it over here. Progesterone. There we go. And estrogen, the reason I drew arrows to the uterus is because estrogen is going to cause the inner lining of the uterus, known as the endometrium, to begin to thicken, to grow special glands, and also an increase in blood supply in anticipation of a potential pregnancy. Progesterone is going to further cause that inner lining of the uterus to develop. And it's actually going to cause these glands in the uterus to start producing a fluid that will nourish the developing embryo if fertilization does occur. So again, luteinizing hormone is going to be released. It's going to do primarily two jobs. One of the jobs is it's going to cause the ovaries to release estrogen and progesterone, and it also is responsible for ovulation, the release of the egg at around day 14, around the middle of the menstrual cycle. That's going to be important. Now, just to backtrack a little bit, the Women also produce testosterone, but not nearly as much as men. So where do women get the testosterone from? Again, the adrenal cortex, the outer layer of the adrenal gland. And males also produce some estrogen, obviously not as much as females. Where is that produced? Again, the adrenal cortex, that outer layer of the adrenal gland. Now, not only does estrogen cause an increase in the development of the inner lining of the uterus, but also female secondary sex characteristics. So, what are these? Redistribution of fat, the development of larger hips, breasts, also the development of underarm hair and hair in the groin region. These are female secondary sex characteristics. And again, they're primarily due to additional estrogen being released during puberty and after puberty. Now, let's go on to some more hormones. And the next one is going to be thyroid stimulating hormone. So I'm going to go ahead, we're going to draw the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is oftentimes, looks like a butterfly-shaped organ. So there's our thyroid gland. I guess we'll label that thyroid. Thyroid gland. And it's going to be stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. So this hormone is going to be released by the anterior pituitary. It's going to go to the target cells in the thyroid gland, and in response to that, the thyroid gland is then going to make thyroid hormone. Known as thyroxine, or sometimes it's referred to as T4. The 4 indicates that it's got 4 iodine atoms attached to it. So what thyroid hormone is going to do, what thyroxine is going to do, is it's going to increase your metabolism long term. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down. I'm going to put an up arrow, that's increase metabolism. Now remember, metabolism is the sum of all those chemical reactions. So this stuff is responsible, in a sense, for speeding you up, your chemical reactions, giving you more energy. And this is going to be long term. So this isn't responsible for, you know, I'm really scared, there's a danger, and I need more energy right now. This is responsible for more long term. This sets your base level of energy, your daily energy level. And if you don't have enough of this thyroxine, you can feel utterly wiped out. You can barely get out of bed in the morning if this gland is not working right and releasing enough thyroid hormone. You feel like you just ran a marathon even though you just slept 12 hours. Along with other things, dry skin and constipation, nothing's going to work right in your body if you don't have enough thyroid hormone. Luckily, they can replace that hormone, give you more of it if you need it, and kind of bring your metabolism back up to normal again. All right, so that's thyroid hormone, thyroxine. Now, there's going to be another gland. Oftentimes, it's kind of embedded right in the back of the thyroid. You know, before I actually get to that, I forgot that the thyroid gland is also going to produce another hormone called calcitonin. Now, calcium. So this has to do with calcium. This is actually responsible for decreasing your blood calcium levels, calcitonin. Calcitonin. So it's responsible for decreasing your blood calcium levels. So if you have too much calcium in your blood, it can actually begin to damage your blood vessels. So what your body's going to want to do is take some of that calcium out of your blood, and it's going to want to store it. So the place where it's going to store calcium long term is mainly your skeletal system. So what this hormone is going to do is going to take the calcium out of the blood and it's going to store it in your skeleton. Now, there's also another hormone that opposes that, and that's what we're going to get to right now. These 4 blue dots represent the parathyroid glands. And there's typically 4 of them. There could be 2, there could be 3, could be 4, could be 5, could even be 6. The number varies from person to person, but usually there's around 4. And that's going to be your parathyroid gland. Para means next to. And these parathyroid glands are going to produce parathyroid hormone, PTH, parathyroid hormone. And what parathyroid hormone is going to do is it's actually going to increase your blood calcium levels. So if you don't have enough calcium in your blood, you need calcium. In fact, all your cells in your body need calcium, but especially the nervous system and the muscular system. And if we don't have enough calcium, the muscles aren't going to work right, and that's bad because your heart muscle is also a muscle. And your nerves and your brain are not going to work properly. So we need enough calcium. We don't want too much though, but we don't want too little either. So if you don't have enough calcium in the blood, we're going to take some calcium, this hormone is going to be released, and we're going to take that calcium from your bones. And we're going to put it into the blood and make it available to the other cells in the body so that they have enough calcium. So that's going to be parathyroid hormone. Let's see, what other hormones do we have released from the anterior pituitary? I think one more. One more that I want to talk about anyhow. And this hormone is going to be, and I'm going to draw it right here, and I'm going to draw the adrenal gland. In the adrenal glands, I'm going to draw a little tiny kidney as best I can here. So this is my little tiny kidney. And on top of the kidney, this is where your adrenal glands are located, right on top of your kidney. And the adrenal glands have an outer layer called the adrenal cortex. And they have an inner layer called the adrenal medulla. And again, if you were to look at them under the microscope, they look differently. And they look differently because they do different jobs. So let's go ahead and start with the cortex, the outer part of the adrenal gland. The outer part of the adrenal gland is going to produce ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone. Adrenal, because this hormone acts on the adrenal gland. Cortico, because it stimulates the adrenal cortex. And when this hormone is released, ACTH, it causes the adrenal cortex to then release 2 more hormones. And these 2 hormones are going to be mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. Now again, the cortico in this case refers to where the hormone is produced. Mineralo means it has to do with minerals. So exactly what are we talking about here? Mineralocorticoids. Well, specifically, it's going to increase sodium reabsorption and get rid of potassium. So we're going to increase the amount of sodium in the blood, and we're going to decrease the amount of potassium in the blood. And this actually works on the kidney, specifically the distal convoluted tubule. It works on the kidney. So we're going to reabsorb sodium from the urine, put it back into our blood. Now sodium tends to be very osmotically active. That means water wants to follow it. So when sodium and water move into the blood, that's going to increase the blood volume, and eventually that's going to raise the blood pressure. And we want a certain amount of blood pressure. Too low of blood pressure, you could pass out and even die. That's not good. So we need this. And glucocorticoids are going to raise the glucose levels long term. Long term. That's why the word gluco is in there. Gluco, it controls glucose. So we're going to raise, it's going to basically set the glucose levels in the body long term. The glucose levels in the bloodstream. Now, we're going to fluctuate up and down depending on whether you've had a meal or whether you've exerted yourself athletically a lot and burned up a lot of glucose. So those minute to minute, hour to hour glucose levels are going to be controlled by insulin and glucagon, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, that are due to the pancreas. But to set your overall baseline glucose levels in your blood long term is going to be glucocorticoids. Now let's go ahead and talk about the adrenal medulla, the center. Now the adrenal medulla produces adrenaline. And we've all heard of adrenaline or epinephrine. This stuff speeds you up. Short term though, and it's what it's going to do. It's going to increase the metabolism. Short term. So if you're in danger and you need a burst of energy to fight or get out of some bad situation, or if all of a sudden you get scared, and again, you need a burst of energy, this adrenaline is going to rev up your metabolism very quickly, within minutes. And it's going to give you that energy you need to get away from something or to fight something. And then, as you kind of burn off that adrenaline, use it up, you're going to go back to normal again. Remember, thyroid hormone, thyroxine, is going to be long-term metabolism. But the adrenaline controls those minute-to-minute, you know, I need more energy at this moment in time type requirements. The last thing I want to talk about is going to be the pancreas. This kind of obscure organ located behind the stomach. So if we go down the sternum, we find this soft spot right below the sternum. That's where your stomach's going to be located. And then if we go behind the stomach, that's where the pancreas is going to be located. And the pancreas, very important organ, does double duty. Not only does it have an endocrine function, but it also has an exocrine function, meaning it releases digestive enzymes and it helps in, or participates in digestion. But let's talk about the endocrine function. You got different cells in the pancreas called the islets of Langerhans. And these cells actually release two hormones. One is going to be insulin. So I'm going to see if I got some room here to write this down, maybe over here. Insulin. And insulin is going to increase glucose, blood glucose levels, short term. Remember, long term is going to be the glucocorticoids. This is going to be short term. And I got that mixed up. It's going to decrease glucose levels. Sorry about that. Decrease glucose levels, blood glucose levels, short term. So let's say you just had a meal and you've digested that meal and you're absorbing the glucose, meaning it's going from your digestive tract into your blood. The concentration of glucose in your blood is going up. And we don't want it to go up too high because then it can begin to damage your blood vessels and other things. So what you're going to do is release insulin, and that insulin is going to take that glucose and it's going to move it into the cell where glucose can then be converted into ATP via the process of cellular respiration. This glucose is also going to be transported into the cells of skeletal muscles, in the cells of liver cells, where it's going to be converted into glycogen, this big polymer made up of glucose molecules. And the reason we're going to do that is so we can store this glucose longer term, hours, maybe even a day or so. That's what insulin is going to do. Now, we've all heard of that disease, diabetes. And one form of the diabetes is where you don't make enough insulin. And if you don't make enough insulin, you can't get the sugar from your blood into the cells where it can then be turned into ATP. So before we could actually make insulin or get insulin from other animals, people would die of type 1 diabetes because they literally starved to death. They were eating lots and lots of food, but yet the sugar from that food wasn't getting into the cells. So literally the cells were starving to death, and that's what people would actually die of, lack of ATP production. Nowadays, we've corrected that situation. Now, the other hormone is going to be glucagon. And these two hormones are what we call antagonistic, meaning they have the opposite effect, kind of like calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. They have the opposite effect of each other. So glucagon is going to increase the blood glucose levels. And again, short term. So maybe it's 11 o'clock and you haven't eaten breakfast. You ate breakfast at 6 or 7 in the morning. You haven't eaten in a couple hours. And your body has burned off some of that blood glucose. And now the blood glucose levels are getting lower and lower and lower. And one of the major usages of blood glucose is going to be the brain. So we don't want to upset the brain. So what we're going to do is the pancreas is going to release glucagon. And this hormone is going to increase blood glucose levels. So where does it get the glucose from? Well, remember just about 2 minutes ago we talked about how we stored glucose in the skeletal muscles, and we stored it in the liver cells in the form of glycogen, that big huge polymer made up of glucose molecules. So what glucagon is going to do is it's going to cause that big glycogen molecule, all those glycogen molecules that we stored, to be broken down. We're going to break down that glycogen into their individual glucose molecules, put the glucose back in the blood so it's available to all the cells in the body, including the brain, until your next meal. And that is going to be it for the endocrine system.